Welcome to the B'nai B'rith International podcast. I'm CEO Dan Mariaschin. Thank you for tuning in today. I'm here today with Ken Ackerman, an attorney and writer based here in Washington, D.C. Ken's published books include Boss Tweed, the corrupt Paul who conceived the soul of modern New York, and Ken's most recent one, Trotsky in New York, 1917, a radical on the eve of revolution. Ken has authored a feature story titled "How an Immigrant Saloon of the 1840s." Yes, we'll pick it up with Ken has authored.
Or actually,
try it again.
Yeah, because I want to just double check.
Okay. It's the great thing about not being live.
Yes, it is.
Being your own producer. You know?
So it is How an Immigrant Saloon of 1840s New York. So there is no.
Oh, of 1840s. I'm sorry. Okay. I said I was a history major, not an English major. So. Okay. So
I know titles are always written by committee, so I never.
Let's take it from the top. Okay. Ready? Okay.
3, 2, 1.
Welcome to the B'nai B'rith International podcast. I'm CEO Dan Mariaschin. Thank you for tuning in today. I'm here today with Ken Ackerman, an attorney and writer based in Washington, D.C. Ken's published books include Boss Tweed, the corrupt Paul who conceived the soul of modern New York, and Ken's most recent one, Trotsky in New York, 1917, a radical on the eve of revolution. Ken has authored a feature story titled "How an Immigrant Saloon of 1840s, New York, gave birth to B'nai B'rith" for our upcoming Winter 2018 magazine issue. The piece is a deeply researched and detailed exploration of B'nai B'rith's founding in New York in the mid-19th century. Ken, thank you for being here today on the podcast.
Well, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure.
So B'nai B'rith is now observing its 175th anniversary. We're founded in New York in 1843. Your article really kind of sets the stage for the founding of that organization, what New York was like at that time, where the Jews lived at that time, the German Jews in particular, and the start that we got, the launch that we got at that time. So let's begin with the question: what was New York like in 1843?
No, well, Dan, thanks for that. New York was a very different place than today. It looked very different. It was smaller. New York in 1843 was mostly located at the southern end of Manhattan Island. It had reached above City Hall Park. It was marching up toward what would become Central Park, but it still had a long way to go. It had about 400,000 or 500,000 people. It was a city that was, in 1843, undergoing a major era of change. At the beginning of the 1800s, New York had about 150,000 people. During the next 60 years till the Civil War, the city would more than quadruple in size. By the time of the Civil War, there would be more than 800,000 people living there. During this time, waves of immigrants would come into the city. The city would have a flavor because of the large immigrant communities that's different than today. There'd be large parts of New York where they didn't speak English. Large parts where the major language was German or Yiddish or other European languages, because people were literally fresh off the boat. The biggest group of people, biggest ethnic group, were the Irish, who were coming in large numbers. Germans were after that. The city looked very different. There were no skyscrapers. The tallest buildings were maybe 3 or 4 stories tall. A lot of the areas where immigrants lived if you saw them today, you would look at them and think they were shanty towns. People came in, they didn't have money, couldn't buy building material, so they would start off just building huts and tents. Over time, as they got money, they would build brick buildings. The area where most of the German and Jewish immigrants lived, an area called Klein-Deutschland. That's what they called it back then, the German word. It was on a part of New York that was then the northern fringe of the city, what today we would consider the upper part of the Lower East Side. Up until the early 1800s, the southern part of that neighborhood was a lake. I mean, there was literally a lake called the the Collect in the lower and just north of what's now City Hall Park. And during the 1700s, it was a very nice place. I mean, it was where people would go for picnics, and it was a very pretty place. But towards the later part of the 1700s, it was the place where people would build breweries and butcher shops and packing plants, and it became very polluted, very smelly, and over time it was filled in with landfill. That spot that was the landfill became the 5 Points, the very notorious slum where the very poorest people went to live. It was mostly an Irish area when the Irish, very poor Irish, first came into the country. Klein Deutschland was just a few blocks to the north of that.
We call it the Lower East Side,
yes.
But it's not quite the Lower East Side
yes.
that we think of, let's say, when my parents immigrated to this country in the beginning of the 20th century, that we associate with the Ashkenazi Eastern European community, correct?
Yes. It's important to separate two stages in Jewish immigration. Starting in 1880, after the assassination of Tsar Alexander II in St. Petersburg, that's when the huge waves of Eastern European Jews would come into New York and into America in the 1880s, 1890s, early 1900s. Before then, the number of Jews was much fewer. By 1843, 1850, there were maybe 10 or 15,000 Jewish people total in New York. That was still a big increase from 50 years earlier when there were only a few hundred, but still the very big waves didn't come later.
But the original arrivals were Sephardic, were they not?
The original
Jewish arrivals.
Yes, the original arrivals in New York were Sephardic. In fact, the first Jews came in the 1600s. There was a group that had been living in Brazil. They were descendants of of Jews who were expelled from Spain in 1492. So they were Sephardic. The German Jews who came in large numbers starting at the beginning of the century, around 1810, 1820, were more Ashkenazi. There was a wave of German immigration starting in the early 1800s because of political unrest in Germany. This was the period after the Napoleonic Wars. There were crackdowns against dissent. This would lead up to the revolutions of 1848. So large numbers of Germans, including relatively large numbers of German Jews, about 40 to 50,000 total by the middle of the century, about 10,000 of those living in New York City. What we consider the Lower East Side changes a lot over time. At its height, the Jewish Lower East Side of around 1910 was considered as starting on 2nd Avenue, where the Yiddish theaters were, essentially the East Village of Manhattan, what's now considered East Greenwich Village, all the ways down to the Brooklyn Bridge and just north of City Hall. Very large, expansive area. Back then, most of that was chopped up into a number of other neighborhoods. The 5 Points was obviously the very poor part. The section right along the river was a Protestant working-class neighborhood. Boss Tweed was growing up there right around this time. The Jewish section was around Delancey Street, about a 4 to 5 block stretch between Delancey and Rivington Street. But it was chopped up among different ethnic groups. Again, the Irish being the largest, the Germans being the second largest.
The founders of B'nai B'rith moved at that time to New York City. They came from Germany.
Yes.
What were they doing? What did they do for work? What was their job? What was the economy like for the Jewish community?
Well, the German Jews who came over and founded B'nai B'rith mostly came over in this wave of German immigration around 1810, 1820, 1830. By the time they founded B'nai B'rith, most of these particular gentlemen had been living in New York for 10 or 20 years. So they had time to develop some roots. They were craftsmen. There was a goldsmith. There was a barber. There was a real estate salesman. There were small shopkeepers in that neighborhood. There were a couple of brewers. Germans drank beer, and Jews were part of that German beer-making culture. The technology of brewing at that time allowed you to make certain easily stored lagers that you could make in your kitchen or in a basement that could store for several weeks at a time before refrigeration. So this was part of the economy as well. So they weren't extremely poor. They weren't rich. They were middle class craftsmen, tradesmen, small shopkeepers.
And one, Aaron Sinsheimer,
Yes.
one of them owned a saloon.
Yes, Aaron Sinsheimer opened a saloon sometime around this era. We don't know the exact date. It was in a three-story townhouse on Essex Street, an old brick building. He opened it on the ground floor. Like many others, there were literally dozens of small saloons like this during the time. And it was part of the culture of the city. It wasn't a unique German thing. It wasn't a unique Jewish thing. At this time, there was no TV, no radio, no movies, no internet, obviously. This is where people socialize. At the end of a hard day working, this is where almost all men would come and meet and talk and socialize, talk about the world, talk about their problems. It was a social center. It was also a political center. Rising young politicians in New York would use saloons as their place to gather a group of like-minded people, form friendships, form alliances. Often the saloon back rooms were the original meeting places of the political parties. Many of the future chieftains of Tammany Hall, future congressmen, started out as saloon keepers and then cemented those relationships into their political operation. So the fact that Sinsheimer's, as a saloon that was popular with Jewish people, Jewish men, would be the place where a political club was founded was very typical of the time. The particular group who founded the B'nai B'rith were generally associated with one particular synagogue, Anshe Chesed, which was relatively new. It catered to German Jews. Within the Jewish community at the time, there was a lot of pulling and tugging and division, both religious and social. Jews being Jews, they were arguing over religion. The Ashkenazi and the Sephardic were at odds with each other. Each local part of Europe had its own congregation, its own practices. At the time in America, Jewish practice was undergoing change. Reform Judaism started in Europe, but it quickly took root in America, because in America we have freedom to do what we want, and people experimented. There were one of the leaders in New York, a man named Mordecai Noah, took the lead at one point in giving a speech at a synagogue supporting English language prayers and using musical instruments in a synagogue, which at the time was revolutionary. Arguments among Jews about religious practice back then resulted in lawsuits because feelings were so strong. The group in
Noah was an early kind of a proto-Zionist, was he not?
Yes.
In terms of his objective of having a Jewish homeland or a place for Jews?
Yeah, a very interesting man, a man who doesn't get nearly the credit he deserves. Mordecai Noah was a Jewish man, but he was a diplomat. He served in, I believe, the James Madison administration as the American consulate in Tangiers in North Africa. He came to New York. He founded a number of newspapers. He became active in politics. He was elected sheriff of New York City as part of the Tammany Hall operation, overcoming some anti-Semitism at the time. When he ran for sheriff, there were protests saying that a Jewish person ought not to be in a position to hang a Christian, which as sheriff you'd have to do sometimes. So that was raised, but he won the election anyways because Tammany knew how to count votes. But he was the one who came up with the idea of purchasing an island in the Niagara River. He named it Ararat, to be a place of refuge for Jews around the world. a Jewish homeland before that idea took root in Europe. It didn't get very far. It was hard. The logistics were very difficult. But it became one of the models for 20th century Zionism.
What brought this particular group, the barber, the small shop owners, the original B'nai B'rith founders, they came to Sinsheimer's Cafe. They could have done something. They simply could have sat there and continued to talk politics or business or whatever. What was it that impelled them to decide to coalesce together and to organize what became B'nai B'rith?
Well, there were a couple of things. The atmosphere they were doing it, as I mentioned, was sharp division within the Jewish community, raising a lot of concerns whether the Jewish community was a community or whether it was just a number of splinter groups going their own way. These gentlemen were also very active in the Freemasons and the Oddfellows, two very popular secular lodges at the time. And they thought that those organizations were a terrific model for how to run a community, how to set up a leadership group. They were based on friendship, they weren't based on religion, they were based on dealing with the objective world. What they wanted to do was to create an organization that would deal with Jews as citizens and people. One of the first things they did when they founded the group was to create a pension program for Jewish widows, so that if a Jewish woman was left alone in the world, she would get a pension of some $30 and then some money to live off of, some money to raise the children. Those kinds of practical reforms that they wanted to accomplish, and the synagogues and other Jewish groups weren't doing it. There's also a suggestion that a number of Jewish men tried to join the Oddfellows and were blackballed. Now, this is a somewhat controversial point. Many of the Jewish founders of B'nai B'rith were members of the Oddfellows group, and they specifically deny that this was based on anti-Semitism by that group. But still, there was an incident where some Jewish members were denied admission. And so that was one of the events that sparked them to think about creating kind of a safe place for Jews, an all-Jewish club. They thought at one point of founding a Jewish lodge of the Oddfellows. Just build it within the Oddfellows organization and have an all-Jewish club. But that seemed to defeat the idea of it being secular, because then you would have a religious test for membership. So they decided to create their own new organization. They put a lot of time into it. They had a number of meetings to haggle over the charter and the membership rules and the rituals and how it would work. But they came up with something that was based on benevolence, friendship, secular ideas. If you look at their minutes and at the charter, you don't see Torah, Talmud, religion. Instead, you see Jewish people, Jewish camaraderie, Jewish needs, very much based on the Masonic and Oddfellow model.
Now, as it turns out, beyond the boundaries of Manhattan, it was German Jews in the Midwest, for example, also in the South, many of them who once the founders, apparently once the word got out of what the founders were doing, the ball was picked up elsewhere. And so we see in places like Cincinnati and Louisville and elsewhere where there were strong concentrations of German Jews, immigrants, children of immigrants, the organization grew. So we certainly pay a great deal of deference to those founders as well, outside New York City, who did so much to build the organization.
Yes, it was very popular. I mean, once they created the first lodge, it only took a few years, as you say, for it to be replicated in cities across the country where there were Jewish populations. And it was attractive because not only was it a Jewish-based organization, where Jews could come together and as friends, as neighbors, as a community, but it had a certain mystique to it at the time. It was a secret organization, very much like the Masons. It had its special rituals. You had to go through several levels of membership originally until you knew what all the rules were. It was you couldn't blackball people the way that some of the other, for instance, there was many Jewish organizations at the time would not allow converted Jews into their midst because they felt they weren't pure Jews. The B'nai B'rith never took that viewpoint. Their doors were open to all comers within Judaism. There was no division between whether you were German, Russian, Hungarian, born in America, born abroad, whether you were religious or not religious, whether you practiced Reform or Orthodox or nothing at all.
If you go down to Essex Street today, we know the building's not there.
Correct.
And as I understand it, on the 150th anniversary of B'nai B'rith, it was 25 years ago, when we were observing that anniversary, I know there was a plaque that was placed there, but I think also the Bicentennial Commission of the City of New York also put a plaque. So what do you see? What's on the spot today?
As I understand it, on that very spot, yes, there's the plaque, but there's also a government office building. I believe it's the City of New York. One of the city departments has an office building there.
Well, that's. I hope they realize the legacy, the legacy that they're, the land at least that they're sitting on. Ken, this is really it's fascinating to hear our history, our B'nai B'rith history, but also the history of Jews in America, the history of Jews in New York, which has the largest Jewish population, and to pause and reflect as we do on this 175th anniversary of B'nai B'rith. So we thank you for the work that you've done in researching and writing about this, and appreciate your coming by to tell the story today.
Well, thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
And thank you, everyone, for listening to our podcast. Please visit our website, bnaibrith.org, like our Facebook page, follow us on Twitter, subscribe on your smartphone through the podcast app for iPhone or through Google Play for Android. And lastly, tell a friend about us. For my guest, Ken Ackerman, I'm Dan Mariaschin. We'll talk to you next time on the B'nai B'rith International Podcast.